If you trust UEFI Secure Boot as a last line of defense, HybridPetya just burned that bridge. Start with a quick picture. Secure Boot is your gatekeeper for system startup. Many teams assume it never fails. HybridPetya proves assumptions dangerous. It can run a malicious bootloader before Windows starts by exploiting CVE 2024-7344. That lets ransomware operate under the radar of most EDR tools. In short, attackers can tamper with the boot process itself. Next, we'll unpack how it actually gets in. Here's the 2-minute elevator version you can tell leadership. HybridPetya targets UEFI systems and bypasses Secure Boot using a specific UEFI app flaw. It plants a bootkit on the EFI System Partition and forces a crash to run before Windows loads. Then it encrypts the master file table, breaking the operating system's ability to locate files. Victims see a fake check disk while their disk index is destroyed. Now, let's walk through each piece in order. What is the master file table, and why attack it? Think of the MFG as the library catalog for your disk. Remove the catalog, and books remain but become invisible. HybridPetya encrypts the MFT with Salsa 20, so Windows can't map files to sectors. That's faster than encrypting millions of files and causes immediate operational chaos. The attackers can then display a ransom demand while you scramble to answer one big question: repair or restore? Let's unpack the malware's two components, the installer and the bootkit. The installer runs in Windows and writes files to the EFI System Partition. It edits boot paths and intentionally triggers a blue screen to force a reboot. On reboot, the bootkit loads before the OS and performs encryption, updates a simple progress counter on the ESP, and then shows a fake disk repair screen. That split design complicates detection and cleanup, and upcoming details explain why. Now the critical exploit. CVE 2024-7344 in a third-party UEFI app called a reloader.efi. The vulnerable reloader looks for an innocuous file on the ESP and will load it without proper validation. Attackers hide an XOR-obfuscated payload named cloak.dat next to legitimate boot files. When a reloader runs, it blindly loads the embedded UEFI application. That's the bypass. Microsoft has since revoked that binary, but not every endpoint has received the revocation yet. Why does revocation matter? Secure Boot uses revocation lists, called DBX, to block known bad binaries. Microsoft revoked the vulnerable reloader in January 2025. If your endpoints have an up-to-date DBX, that loader can't run. But many organizations lag on DBX updates, and mixed OEM fleets complicate rollouts. So revocation is powerful, but only when applied. Up next, how to check revocation status and patch gaps across a fleet. Look for signs of a bootkit in the wild. Repeated BSODs, followed by persistent check disk screens, are suspicious. Writes to the EFI System Partition from unexpected processes are red flags. Sudden NTFS volumes that appear healthy but are inaccessible deserve immediate investigation. Baseline bootloader hashes and alert on changes. If your EDR can inspect firmware components, enable that capability. If not, schedule offline ESP checks with trusted tools. Careful, firmware tools can be invasive. Hardening the boot process is straightforward and effective. Lock down the EFI System Partition permissions and monitor critical paths like bootmgfw.efi. Enable measured boot with TPM attestation to detect boot tampering. Use BitLocker bound to TPM and Secure Boot, and validate PCR bindings so unexpected bootloader changes trigger recovery. Minimize third-party boot components and avoid untrusted recovery tools. Later, we'll map this hardening into a short weekly checklist your ops team can execute. Build monitoring and playbooks for firmware attacks. Map detections to MITRE ATT&CK T1542.003 and add bootkit indicators to SIEM rules. Capture ESP images as part of forensics and preserve evidence before reboots. Assume OS-level tools may miss pre-OS components. Engage firmware-capable incident response partners early. Plan to reprovision affected devices from verified offline backups rather than try surgical fixes. This sequence changes how you isolate and recover, and you should rehearse it now. What should you do this week? First, verify Secure Boot is enabled across endpoints. Second, confirm systems received the January 2025 DBX and Windows updates. Third, audit a sample of ESPs for unexpected files like cloak.dat or modified boot MGFW. Fourth, enforce BitLocker with TPM and review PCR policies. And finally, rotate high-privilege credentials and review lateral movement telemetry. These steps reduce exposure quickly, but there's one more strategic step worth discussing. Invest in firmware hygiene as a standard operating practice. Treat DBX updates like OS patches. Track OEM firmware versions, and use centralized tools to deploy UEFI updates where possible. Include firmware validation in your golden images and build pipelines. Train first responders on bootkit signs so they don't accidentally reboot away evidence. Over time, this reduces the attack surface and shortens response windows. Now a quick recap before we close with a recommended checklist you can copy. Recap in one paragraph. HybridPetya uses a UEFI bootkit and CVE 2024-7344 to bypass secure boot and encrypt the MFT. The exploit runs pre-OS, hides behind fake check disk and demands ransom, while standard EDR may miss it. Defenders must apply DBX revocations, harden and monitor the EFI System Partition, enable TPM-backed protections, and prepare firmware-aware incident response. Start with the quick checklist we outlined and escalate to firmware program changes if you find gaps. Ready for the closing checklist? If this helped you, like and subscribe for concise, actionable security breakdowns. Comment with your top mitigation step so other teams can learn from your experience.